your expertise in constitutional history. It isn't just a sort of nice academic dusty book thing. It is the correct lens through which to look at our present predicament. And this, I suppose, is a bit of a communications problem question that I've got from Valerie Coker. But nevertheless, you and I are going around attempting to communicate this idea. She says, I find David's explanation of how Tony Blair took sovereignty away from Parliament very convincing. But I suspect that the average voter has no real understanding as to how it affects anything. Same as saying we should leave the ECHR. I suspect people only hear abandoning human rights and assume that they would somehow lose their rights, whatever that means. How can we get the message across in a way that the average person will understand and respond to? Now, I guess to some degree, this is a kind of Saatchi and Saatchi style question about what the slogan is and the rest of it. And you and I have talked that probably at some point we need to market research, some opinion polling into working out how that works. But what's your first blush thoughts about that? I appreciate we go around talking mainly to the politicized, people who are members of the party.
Or convertible.
Yeah, the convertible, or at least people who take a keen interest in politics. But my experience of knocking on doors, never has somebody said to me, well, can you please explain what your position is on Northcote Trevelyan and the reform of the civil service, right? Whereas what they've usually said is, why am I paying so much tax and my wages aren't going up and nobody's fixed the potholes, right? That typically what you at least hear at first instance are these retail end politics about, well, understandably, their wage packets, the tax rates, the failure of they can't get a GP appointment. That's what you hear at first blush, not grand constitutional principles. So what are your thoughts about how we kind of communicate this in a way that kind of means something to the average person? The only reference point I have on that is the Brexit referendum, which you could have argued was a complex constitutional matter, but clearly infused, 17 million people voted to leave, but also clearly infused people who had never voted before. The more votes cast than in any British election in history, more votes cast for a single proposition than any election in history. How do we get the Starkey Thesis and the Great Restoration into, if you like, what worked for Brexit in 2016?
Well, I think Brexit was literally, not simply, formally, but actually a dress rehearsal. Why there was that vote was precisely the sense something had gone wrong. Take back control. I mean, people remember, anybody who is British has been brought up, however distantly, on that sense. We are in charge of our own destinies. And of course, Europe, literally, our membership of the European community meant literally that we weren't. And people understood that. It's not very difficult to explain. And you know what? I think there's something else that we need to understand. I've just been reading the establishment shot at explaining all of this lot, which is Vernon Bogdanor's book, published in 2009, on the new constitution. In other words, acknowledging that indeed, exactly what I've been saying, that there was this process of revolutionary change. And do you know what he attributes it to fundamentally? Our joining the EU.
Right.
The moment we joined the EU, all the basic rules were effectively thrown through the window. However,
in favor of a more universalist liberal European
in favor of a universalist liberal polity. And above all, the first thing that went through the window was the idea that the British people could control their own destiny. Instead, our destiny was subordinated to our sovereignty, our ability to control ourselves, was merged into this larger entity, however much it was fudged to begin with. And of course, it was fudged to begin with. And if you actually read the small print, yes, it was spelled out. But the Lord Chancellor at the time that Edward Heath took us into what we all call the common market, pointed out that inevitably there was a major shift of sovereignty. And if this fact was not spelled out, he says very clearly, it will come back to bite you. And that's exactly what it
happened.
did do. And you saw somebody like Margaret Thatcher, who'd been at the heart of government, effectively the scales falling from her eyes. as she dealt more and more with Europe, and the final business, of course, of the creation of the single currency, the setting up of a European central bank, and so on. Those extraordinary comments during her last appearance, in Parliament, when she, what's her, she's asked what's her reaction, and I think it's Dennis Skinner pipes up, oh, she's going to be governor, and she of the Central European Bank, and she comes back, no, 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 no. This represents the undercutting of the sovereignty of each people of Europe, she says.
Mhm.
So I think that that's the idea you need to get over, that the joining of our joining at the hip with the European Union. And if you read Bogdanov's analysis, you see even in 2009, he thought it was absolutely impossible that would ever be reversed.
Yes, so interesting. And therefore, actually, our membership of the EU, look, I'm not going to compare it to the Civil War, but it's another instance in history where we took a turn, we
And
stuck
we
with it for a
decided
while, and then we reversed it.
it is precisely. And it seems to me that if we've been going around, we've been listening to people, we've been talking to people. There is that same sense of something having been lost, something having been taken away, that sense of self-government having been taken away. Because people talk about a revolutionary mood in the country. I don't think it's revolutionary. I think there's something sadder. There's a sense of loss. There's a sense of nostalgia, of deprivation. Again, people are talking about, we want our country back. There is, and of course, all of this is again very closely associated, because alongside the joining of the EU came the importation of the European Convention on Human Rights and its fundamental challenge to the whole way we'd always done law. And it's very striking, again, when you look back, the convention is drawn up bizarrely by conservative politicians. I think Mark, and we need to understand this. I've been pretty harsh about the conservatives who went along with this. But I think it's very easy to understand why people behaved as they did from 1945. You'd been through, within everybody's lifetime, the second of these terrible wars. There was a passionate desire somehow to stop it happening ever, ever again. And I think the thing that's most surprised me, because one of the things I've been doing as a result of our work, I've been reading things that I would never, ever otherwise have read. And one of the things I read was Quentin Hogg, Lord Hailsham. I just remember Hailsham, rather distantly as this bell-waving, great rotund, vehement, highly intelligent Tory. In his book that he writes on conservatism in 1947, that's 2 years after the Great Labour victory, he begins by saying, as of course conservatives, we would welcome world government. And he, of course, in 1976, is the first person of any political party to talk about Britain as having an elected dictatorship and to talk about conservative, a desire for a written constitution and a Bill of Rights. So you can see what brew it all comes out of.
Yeah.
But what we've discovered, I think, is just how terribly it goes wrong. As always, you ask me, how would I persuade people? You began by talking about the things they do complain about. And one of the reasons that we can't build anything, why the economy is frozen dead, is, of course, because we have reaped the consequences of doing what was intended from 1997 onwards. We've created a rigorous separation of powers. We've enormously empowered our judges, and they do what judges are supposed to do. They stop Parliament doing anything. So, in other words, the criticism always of a separation of powers, in which you, as in the American Constitution, you separate out the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative, is they all fight each other. And of course, the Americans at least have had several couple of 100 years of getting used to this.
Yeah.
We just did it at one fell swoop with, again, what's extraordinary, Mark, no serious popular consultation, no broad-based political agreement, no broad-based discussion. But what we can see is its consequences are disastrous. Everybody admits, even on the left, as you were saying, we've never been worse governed.